Right now, I'd like to take a moment to introduce Dr. Stephen Wicker. He's going to be discussing privacy of place in the age of cellular convergence. I've had the pleasure of reading a couple of Dr. Wicker's books through the years, as I'm sure a few of you in the audience have done as well. Dr. Wicker is a professor of electrical and computer engineering at Cornell University. As of mid-2012, he has supervised over 40 doctoral students or dissertations, and he's a fellow of IEEE. Professor Wicker is the author of Codes, Graphs, and Iterative Decoding, which was published in 2002 on Cluer, Turbo Coding and Cluer in 1999, Error Control Systems for Digital Communications and Storage, and Reed-Solomon codes in their applications. Professor Wicker is the Cornell Principal Investigator for the Trust Science and Technology Center, a National Science Foundation center dedicated to the development of technologies for securing the nation's critical infrastructure. With that, I'd like for you to welcome him with a very warm hand of applause.
And thank you very much. Sorry about those books, by the way. I just wanted to relay a few things before I dive into my talk. I understand the screening exam is still in place after all these years. Is that correct? Yeah, by the way, numbers, this is my 25th anniversary of defending, and I guess it's about the 29th of taking that screening exam. It's a highly refined form of torture. Now that I'm a faculty member, I think it's great. I think it's a fantastic idea. But at the time, I was not looking forward to it. And I must admit, there was one person I feared, and feared greatly, Professor Polidorus. I was not looking forward to his questions. He had a reputation back then. But surprisingly, it went pretty well. And fortunately, with my advisor, Professor Welch, it went well. But there was one gentleman, Lloyd Griffiths. He put up a Z-transform, and it was the ugliest looking Z-transform I'd ever seen in my life. And he asked me to analyze it. It was time variant. It was really strange. And I beat my head against the wall for 20 minutes. And finally, you know, I started thinking, well, good thing I have a job at Hughes. Maybe I'll move back to Mississippi. When I finished, and I said, I can't do any more, he said, I can't solve it either. And I almost killed him, but then I quickly realized that, you know, I'm not going to pass this test if I kill one of the faculty. So I'd like to move on and talk about a new area I've been working in for the last few years. It's utterly fascinated me, this idea of privacy and how information has both a syntactic and semantic context. As information theorists, we tend to focus on the syntactic, but there's a lot of things going on in the world of privacy as privacy gets more and more interesting. And I think we as information theorists have some room to make some comments. And along the way, I'm going to show you that virtually any problem, if you beat on it hard enough, can be made a coding theory problem. So let's dive right in. I'd like to say a few words to echo Dr. Viterbi's talk, something I call cellular convergence. More and more things are moving on to the cellular platform. For a variety of reasons which have been discussed, including Moore's Law. These things include email, texting, it could go on and on, podcasts, music, games, location-based services I want to focus on. It's an example of an app. I think someone said earlier, maybe yesterday, that the app marketplace is where it's at. Well, that's what we're going to talk about a little bit today. I do want to note the biggest number I've heard so far, 5 billion. That's the current estimate of the number of active cell phone accounts in the world. Roughly 12 years ago, the penetration in the United States was 17%. Today, it's 102.4%. So that counts Luddites and babies. So basically what this means is that there are a lot of people out there with more than one cell phone. I've only got one, but everyone in my family over the age of 6 months does have a cell phone. Now, what's important to remember, though, given this ubiquity of cellular technology, is that it is a surveillance technology. Records are developed and kept. In fact, they're now kept an arbitrarily long period of time by the service providers. And those records are of great interest to marketers. Obviously, hackers would love them. And they've been a magnet for law enforcement. Nothing necessarily wrong with that, but it has become a very important tool to law enforcement, to the point that 1.3 million requests were made for cellular information in the past year. That's a lot of requests, all right? And as you can see here, this is relatively coarse-grained information. You know, if you're claiming to have been in Chicago when you were in LA, you may have a problem. But if you're claiming to be at one place on campus, you're really another. No, not so much. And this is the way things have been up until recently. But changes have occurred. Several years ago, the FCC promulgated something called E911. It was actually a great idea. If you call 911, excuse me, on your cell phone, you're locked in the trunk, let's say, of your car. You really don't want the service providers having to search the entire cellular area to find you. You'd like them to zoom right in. And so what the FCC said was, well, maybe we can make this more precise. Maybe we can find a way to get, I don't know, within a couple yards maybe of the cell phone. And after a lot of technology development, which, by the way, this turned out to be quite a gift to Qualcomm, because CDMA is also the technology that's used by GPS. So it all worked out. Now virtually everyone has GPS on their cell phones. So it's what we call a positive externality. But what it does is it further refines that location estimate. So we're getting closer and closer to where you are in these records. Well, recently, and very recently, Apple and Google decided to take this to the next level. Unfortunately, they didn't make it public until they were forced to. Just last year, Alistair Allen and Peter Warden found a file on one of their iPhones. And what this file was a series of GPS-tagged location estimates for cell sites and access points. So it'd be a listing of all the access points and cell sites that your phone can hear, as well as your current GPS position. Curious. But it was also unencrypted, which created a problem. Basically, it allowed people, even I was able to get on my phone, take this file out and see where I'd been for the past year. As you can see, I spent a fair amount of time on the East Coast. That's Ithaca up at the top. The big blue ball is New York City, my favorite place to fly in and out of. You can see I drive all the way down to Virginia Beach, where my parents live. A lot of information. Apple says it was anonymized. Well, if you include this with all my conference trips, the fact that I go to Mississippi a fair amount, where other parts of my family are from, you could probably figure out that this was me without too much trouble. By the way, here's my trip to a conference in Kauai. You can see me driving around the island. I had a lot of fun, flew into Honolulu, as you can tell. It's not very anonymized. So let's talk about that a little more. First, though, what were Apple and Google doing? What they were doing was something called crowdsourcing, and it was relatively benign, aside from the anonymity issues. What they did was they said, all right, I'd like to know exactly where a cell tower is, or an access point. Assume that's the triangle. I'm going to take all of the Apple iPhones, let's say, in the area, and have them give me measurements of the amount of power they're getting. And, of course, I'll also get their GPS coordinates, but we'll scrub their names, so hopefully there's no problem. The next step is to take this data and simply find the weighted centroid. And it's a fairly simple problem. In fact, it's a really simple problem. And if you have enough measurements, you're going to get an extraordinarily accurate estimate of where that cell site is, or where that access point is. Well, what do you do with this? Well, if you want to find out where someone is exactly, you take that map of access points and cell sites, and then you ask the phone that's asking for a location-based service, what do you hear? What are the access points? What are the cell sites that you can, quote, see, unquote, and how strong is the information coming from those sites? And then you do a little analysis, and you get a really fast estimate that is actually more accurate, in many cases, than the GPS estimate. It's powerful stuff. But it creates a privacy problem. One of the neat things about Cornell, as well as USC, is that we have all kinds of interesting people. We have people who study medieval philosophy. They don't get as many grants, but that's all right. We have people who study all kinds of different things. And so there are sociologists and philosophers to whom I can ask questions like, why should I care about this? And what I found was that in these discussions, there's a thresholding effect. It's okay, at least as far as I'm concerned, that people know I'm in LA. But if they're tracking me from residence to residence, they may get a lot more information about me that I'm comfortable with. or perhaps you'll feel the same way. What does your location say about you? If you're getting actual address level information, well, there's a lot of interesting things that people will learn. Your home, what kind of neighborhood you've got, your socioeconomic status, etc. That may not be so bad, but what about your friends' homes? How often do you visit? Do you spend the night? The stores you frequent. You know, I'm thinking about the Commons in Ithaca. We have lots of different kinds of stores, some of which you would not want to be found in. Okay. Visits to hospitals. What does that say about your health status? You can even specify certain classes of diseases based on the clinics being visited. Do you visit high crime areas? Why do you do that? There's all kinds of things you can learn about a person's preferences or beliefs once you get down to that address level area. So hopefully I'm getting you scared. Let me say a little bit about the philosophical and sociological side. One of the things I've learned, and by the way, this I hope is the first talk ever to mention Martin Heidegger and Claude Shannon in the same talk. But we'll see what happens. Heidegger found that we ascribe meaning to place. In fact, it's our interaction with place that gives us a sense of self. For example, I'm thoroughly loving being back here on campus. It's a wonderful feeling. How would that feeling change if I was constantly bombarded with information about the pizza place across the street or something like that? It would disturb that relationship. That's what location-based advertising does. It shifts the semantic content of your relationship with where you are in the neighborhood to consumption. Okay, and that can be a problem. And of course, with location-based advertising, that is so precise, they know where you are and whether or not you're going into the store, it brings us to a whole different level of manipulation, which can be problematic. So how can we do this? I promised you some coding type problems. How can we create anonymized location-based services? Because obviously it's great. I like knowing where the nearest espresso store is as much as anybody else. And I'm okay with pizza too. But how can I use these services and maintain my anonymity? Well, they claim crowdsourced data is anonymized. I hope I've convinced you that that's a really hard problem to do, because all that information I showed you from my iPhone was in the same file. It's all bundled together, creating an immense location trace. A lot of information about somebody who's probably from Mississippi, spends time in LA, etc. All right, so these kinds of attacks then, or excuse me, this kind of data is open to a class of attacks which I call correlation attacks. And there have been some wonderful examples of supposedly anonymized data being broken, if you will, through these kinds of attacks. The AOL search database is probably one of the more famous. There was a Netflix challenge. Netflix wanted to crank up their recommendation system. So what they did was they published an anonymous database, supposedly, that had typical recommendation information, and they asked the world, give us an algorithm that'll make our recommendation system even better. Well, they got an answer, but it wasn't one they liked. Narayanan and Shmetakov at Texas were able to correlate that supposedly anonymous database with existing information, and they broke down the whole thing. So simply stripping names off is not enough. We have to do a bit more. So the question arises then, and here's our Shannon theoretic approach, is there an equivalent to unicity distance when it comes to accumulating location information? Is there a point beyond which we have enough information that we can, with high likelihood, correlate this anonymous information with a known database and figure out whose location trace it is? Simple approach, although really hard to implement in practice. It's been a lot of fun, and again, it does involve tying what we've previously thought of as purely syntactic approaches to information theory to semantics. 5 minutes, okay. So let's get to how this might actually work. So what I did was I developed this model, and I'll be happy to provide you with a reference for it. And it really wasn't the model itself, it was the dynamics of the model, the way things grew that taught me how to go about designing these location-based services that are anonymous. First thing you have to note is an LBS basically has two functions. It's going to start with your location to some level of granularity. Then it's going to take a database, map your location to that database to generate a map, a route, something like that, that will get you to that espresso shop or pizza shop, whatever the case may be. So the question then arises, how can we do these two functions and retain anonymity? The first is relatively easy if slow. We can determine subscriber location on our handsets quite easily without getting any information from the network. If it's a cold start, GPS might take 12.5 minutes. If you're desperate for coffee, that's a long time. You might be able to get a little bit of information from the network through what's called network-supported GPS, but you're giving away some of your position information. Mapping the location of the functionality, however, creates a problem. Basically, what we want to do is give the network the coarsest possible information about our location. The network gives us a database, and then we do the analysis on our phone. So now we've got the classic computation communication trade-off. We are adding to the data load that's going through our cellular networks by trying to maintain some sense of anonymity. In current work, we're trying to characterize that very carefully. We want to get just back before that threshold where we're getting address level data and see how much we're increasing the amount of information that has to be sent to the phone to develop this location-based service capability. Now, there is a full solution, again, which I can point to in a particular reference. It came out in Communications of the ACM. The idea is to have fully anonymous service. Now, this is problematic because you have to be able to prove to the system that you paid your bill. Imagine trying to get service from AT&T without saying who you are. We actually solved this problem, though, through what are called zero-knowledge proofs. It's relatively straightforward. The basic idea is you get a certificate from the network, you encrypt it using the network's public key and send it back, and that way they know you're a valid user because you got this, this information. Along with this information, you include an equipment tag, which is then used instead of your phone number to route information to you. So this actually works. The only problem is service providers aren't going to be wild about it. Neither will law enforcement. And I can provide those references if you're interested. Okay, so location-based services in conjunction with this highly refined ability to figure out where people are has crossed a threshold. We're now at the address level. It's problematic for all the reasons I suggested. Privacy-aware approaches, though, a bag of tools, if you will, that allow us to create these systems so that they are more privacy-aware, they offer many solutions. And I want to try and convince you that as information technologists, knowing that those tools are available is a really important thing. Regulations would also help, but as you've seen, Congress doesn't move as quickly as we would like. Any questions?